Hi, I'm being told I'm live. So hopefully you can all see and hear me. Maybe if somebody were just to confirm that as a chat live, that'd be great. So I can see that we've got, I think it's 20 people or something here already. So thank you so much for joining. And I'll start once we hit the 2000 hours. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. So thank you for joining. Thank you for joining me here in my home, in my cell. This reading is kindly facilitated by two generous people, Roz and Simon Lewis. During this pandemic, they set up a space for writers to share their work live on YouTube at the Holding Cell. I met Simon for the first time last year at the Cork City Library, at the launch of his poetry collection, Amen. And that was also launched alongside Emily Cullen's collection, Conditional Perfect. And both of those books were published by Dura Press. So I will read for approximately 15-20 minutes, and during that time we'll read 10 to 12 short poems. I will have a follow-on reading on Poetry Day on the 30th of April, and would be delighted if you joined me again for another short poetry reading with a different selection of poems. So I'm going to start off with a poem I wrote a number of years ago when I was convalescing after an operation. And I think this poem is apt for what we are all going through today. Only yesterday. Only yesterday, they lifted the garden table and placed it here, where today the sun shines, fresh coffee to hand. The crows caw, flies buzz by, swallows are quiet after a morning of building. Their flight synchronized, so not a feather touches, as each fly in and out of their nest. The grass is topped with white and yellow daisies, buttercups, plantain, dock leaves, and clover. An aeroplane overhead and a single car breaks the silence. So my next poem is called A Change of Life. And this was published in 2018 in the Irish Examiner. A change of life. We sit side by side, one inkwell each. Brass plates slide to uncover the dark liquid below. Nibs inked, ready. Her feet moving in rhythm on the pedal, hands guiding the material, stitching life into a new dress. In Debarra's, the school desk with empty inkwell covers the topless Singer sewing machine, threadless. The pole outside our house shows where the branches grew, little bumps in an otherwise straight, tall tree. Another tree formed into a church pew, no longer pew, as we sit sipping beers on a hot summer day. The table that once bore breakfast, dinner and tea holds computer and vinyl. No sign of butter or crumb. My journals stand in line in a cupboard, halfway up the wall, where sugar, jam, bread and tea were stored. So this poem talks to the metamorphosis in inanimate objects, not a biological transformation, but a change in purpose, a change of life. And the Singer sewing machine is a feature in the public house in Debarras in Clonakilty, where a tabletop sits over the legs of the sewing machine. The Singer sewing machine was a familiar object in our house, and the person in this poem who is guiding the material, stitching life into a new dress, was my mother. So the next poem is called Urchin. In memoriam, Alan Kurdi. Heads down, we walk on harbour view, find the white heart shapes of the sea potato, light as a feather, empty of life, small holes in a precise pattern, visible now that the soft spines to fend off predators are no longer needed. So this poem I wrote 10 days after the body of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian boy, was washed up on a beach in Turkey. I was just walking on the beach nearest to us called Harbour View, and this poem came to me. It was published in Picaroon Poetry in July 2016. Thanks very much for, because the people that are putting notes up there, Francis, Rafiq and Terry. And the next poem actually is dedicated to Rafiq. So I'll read the poem and then talk a little bit about it afterwards. Father to Daughter for Rafiq Kathwari. Do you realize there's a war going on? I didn't. Used to being stopped at security checkpoints, Strabane, Auchnacloy. Sounds of war do not stifle a 22-year-old. Lights out, blinds down, pretend we are invisible as our plane prepares to land. At work, Ahmed pours sweet tea, small glass too hot to hold. An Arab friend gently plucks stray hairs from my face, working thread with fingers. High fashion, handmade, from Burda patterns, covered for mosque with abaye. 5 women dressed in black on our way to Gilani Mosque. A letter goes astray to Tehran, but finds me safe on Haifa Street, Baghdad. So I worked in an administrative role in Baghdad in the early 1980s, and this poem intimates that even in war or during times of turbulence, some form of normality exists. And as Michael Gorman, another poet from Sligo that I heard on the Kirch Festival during the week, said, you know, it takes a very long time sometimes for things to settle in us and for us to be able to write about them. So it was about 30 years after having been in Baghdad that this poem got written. And Rafiq Kathwari just happened to share something online about the possibility of a war crimes tribunal for the war in 2003 in Iraq. And it just stirred something within me and allowed me then to write this poem. So thanks, Rafiq, for that. And that poem was published on Poet Head in February 2017. And the words in that poem, do you realize there's a war going on? That was my father talking to me and saying those words. So the next one talks to children, and I think what we can all learn from children. A toddler shows the way. He toddles up, down and across the doctor's waiting room, smiles all round as he looks each in the eye. White, black, man, woman, young, old, well-dressed or not. And this was published in Live Encounters Poetry Online in December 2018. So the next poem is called, I've got 2 very short poems here. they're concerned with, I guess, my mother, and they're concerned with leave taking in general. So the poem is called Leave Taking. A rustle of dry leaves, wind blown, inside. Our friends return to Copenhagen, London, Cologne. My mother's death day, a kitten adopts us. So we live in a farming area here, and we frequently have kittens and cats walk up to our house, and sometimes they, like in the old Greek stories, you fed them before they told you their story. So sometimes we decide not to feed them, otherwise we would be totally inundated. But we become their servants. So on my long run this morning, I felt my mother saying to me, don't just read a poem about me having died, read something about me living. So this one is called Tourists. The last house before the pier, taking the shortcut from the port. You lure them in for tea and company. So we lived just outside Burtonport in Donegal. And at that time, when I was growing up, we literally were the last house before the pier. And yeah, my mum just loved talking to visitors and inviting them in for tea and company. So the next poem, I'm going to read it and talk about it. It's called Okonkwo. There is no story that is not true. Chinu Akebe. For JL. As I relax in Inchidani reading Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, I follow his life, page after page, afraid for what is to come for Okonkwo. You walking your dog in the wood near your house, encounter a man hanging. As if you were a squirrel, you scaled that tree and brought him to ground. You did not know his name, then or now, but know that he lives. 24 hours later, I entered a different forest, but could do nothing to save Okonkwo. So Chinua Achebe was a Nigerian writer, taught at universities in Nigeria and in the US, and his book, Things Fall Apart, addresses the issue of traditional ways of life coming into conflict with new and often colonial points of view. He died in Boston in 2013. A previous version of this poem called Hanging Number 2 was first published on headstuff.org in November 2015. And that was actually my very first poem to have gotten published. And the editor at the time was Alvi Carraher. And so it's a really special connection for me, both with Headstuff, with Alvi, and with that poem. So we're at a time of the year now, excuse me, where the swallows have returned. And this poem is called The Swallows. The swallows returned to their old nest. Protecting their eggs, he stood guard at night. No match for the magpie who attacked at dawn. Feathers askew, they fly in concert with friends and start all over again. So that poem was published in Ropes in 2016. That's a journal by the MA with the National University of Ireland in Galway. And their theme at the time was independence, as in 1916, 2016. So we can look at independence, I think, in a number of different ways. And I think we can learn a lot, not just from toddlers, but also from animals in how they treat one another. So as a parent, this is one of my day and nightmares. Thankfully, I only had to deal with it, the truth of it, in a poem. Submerged. First time it happened, you were a baby. Driving my car, we were airborne, heading for the reservoir. Car submerged, no handle to open a window. Next day, we were still here. No watermark, no mark at all. Now even my electric windows don't work, but I no longer care. You fly through the city on your single speed, no need for wings. I dig for worms or words, never knowing which will surface. And that was published in Cinnamon Corners Anthology in 2017. So I know we've got people from the US and I think India and certainly Ireland and the UK, and I'm not sure what other countries we have here. But this is for, I guess, my English friends, but really it's for people all over the world as well. Because I think we all, certainly we live in a valley here, and, you know, all over the place, it's wonderful to have alternative energy, but we also have pylons to deal with. And so this is called HS2. Virgin lands cut by rivers, trees reaching up and out, places to hide, nurtured by animals, mountains with frozen tops, Cullen Valley, Hancock's Barn. Gallivanting had to stop. Crops needed planting and fences mending. South Covington Wood. Of steel and concrete from London, high-speed rail, northwards through ancient woodlands, Whitmore Heath. Foxes, rabbits, badgers, and peoples whose homes will be obliterated, absorb the shock. Helpless, or fight to traverse the vast ravine between Parliament and people. Cullen Valley, Hancock's Barn, South Covington Wood, Whitmore Heath. So that poem was published on the UCD Poetry Archive 2017. And that archive, if you just did a Google for UCD Poetry Archive, you can find a number of my poems there, but you can also find an incredible treasure of poems from people, from mainly Irish people. But it's a really wonderful resource. So my final poem is called Listen. And this, within the past months, during the pandemic that we're all living through, and a number of people, again, like Roz and Simon, who are spending their time facilitating us as writers to be able to communicate with people. There are a number of other people like Liz Quirk and some of her colleagues who have set up this website called pandemic.ie, and there are a lot of wonderful poems on that and stories as well. And this is published on the pandemic.ie website. Listen. O silence, I searched for you, but when you came, you weighed more than I could bear. I walked in the forest, heard the birds and the wind. Only the fox made no sound. Lying on the floor, the trees above made me dizzy. Branches and whole tree trunks swaying, silenced by glass. I listened to the soil, water, and air, to hear them whisper, I know I must be quiet. Thank you very much. So I really appreciate you taking the time out to come and join me here. And I wish we were all in one room and I could see you all, but I can see some names there, and maybe afterwards, I can't record the live chat, but if you'd like to maybe send me an email or a WhatsApp or a Facebook or whatever, just to say you were here, I'd really appreciate that. I'd love to hear from you. So I will be here again on Poetry Day, the 30th of April, and I will be reading at 1 p.m. Irish time. There's a separate link for that, but if you go to theholdingcell.eu, you'll find all of the links for all of the other readers as well. So I'll be reading at 1 o'clock, and I'd love if you could make it. It'd be wonderful. So that's really it. Thank you very much, and good night. Take care.